Great. Hi, everyone. I think we should hopefully be live now and the broadcast should be working. I'll start properly in just a second to make sure the live stream's probably started before we actually get on with the event. Cool. Okay. Hopefully that's fine. Well, hi, everyone. Welcome to tonight's discussion and Q&A event for Andrew Anastasi's volume of translations, The Weapon of Organization, Mario Tronti's Political Revolution in Marxism. I'm Dante. I'm a member of a workerist study group, which has organized this event in collaboration with our co-hosts, Notes from Below. And I'm going to briefly introduce the plan for this evening before passing on to Andrew. So obviously the primary intention for tonight is to hear from Andrew on his superb new series of translations and commentaries of Mario Tronti's work. The book is, as Asad Haider writes for the blurb, a groundbreaking moment. In bringing together this range of texts, we gain an enriched perspective of how Tronti both navigated and helped to shape the political militancy of 1960s Italy, and also gauge why his work remains so crucial today when thinking through the dilemmas of struggle and organization. Andrew's text not only gives us access to these work through his translations, but in this volume offers vital context and periodization of Tronti's writing and thought, so the readers can situate more clearly how some of Tronti's ideas were interventions in turbulent debates and disputes of that decade. Tronti's famed theorizing of the strategy of refusal, or his reflections on the complex relationship between working class struggle, trade unions, and the official communist movement, are now more readily understood in the context from which they emerged. Tronti's work and influences, of course, seeped into parts of the far left in the Anglophone world throughout the last few decades, but as Andrew notes in his introduction, his voice has often been heavily muffled and reliant on the retelling and accounts of other thinkers and activists. But with this work, alongside that of his recently translated Workers in Capital, it's now possible to engage with Tronti directly so as to think through the utility of his thought, its strengths and its limitations in a vastly different political moment. With the era of mass communist parties, a post-war class composition behind us, which was so crucial to the conditions of Tronti's interventions, we can now gauge which political and theoretical weapons that Tronti offers us today, and how, as communist militants, we might orient ourselves towards struggle. As Tronti notably said of Karl Marx's Capital, it should be judged only on the basis of capitalism today. And equally, we are now in a position to judge Tronti's own work in a similar sense by measuring it against the current crises of capitalism and global cycles of struggle. So tonight we'll first hear from Andrew, who will be reflecting on his experience in selecting, translating, and compiling these texts and offering some commentary on the experience and what he finds valuable in Tronti's work today. Then we are lucky enough to be joined by Lorenza Monaco, an editor of Notes from Below, who'll follow up with some of her own reflections and have a short dialogue with Andrew on the text. Finally, before we move on to open discussion from those watching the event, we'll have a few specific questions from comrades Matthew, Clark, and Ollie, who are part of the workerist study group who helped organize tonight's event. So if you have any questions that you want to ask Andrew around his book or Mario Tronti in general, please put them in the YouTube chat for the live stream, and we'll kind of compile them and then offer them to Andrew at the end of the event. So feel free to put questions throughout the talk or put them at the end. So I'll now pass over to Andrew. Andrew Anastasi is a member of the editorial collective of Viewpoint magazine and also a PhD candidate at City University in New York. And of course, he is the translator, editor, and compiler of Weapon of Organization, Mario Tronti's Political Revolution in Marxism. Thanks. I'll pass over to Andrew now.
Thank you, Dante, for that really phenomenal introduction. And thank you all for coming to this live stream, wherever you might be, whether you're in the UK, EU, US, anywhere in the world. I appreciate you making time to come out today. And I also want to thank Lorenza and Jamie and all of Notes from Below for hosting the event, as well as Clark, Matthew, and Ollie for their engagement today and some of the questions that we'll be talking about later. So I'm really proud to present this book. This is my first published book. It was published by Common Notions, a US-based press, late last year, and it contains 17 original translations of texts that were composed by Mario Tronti, a giant of 20th century radical thought, one of the most important political thinkers of post-war Italy, especially among Marxists and activists of the radical left, for whom he's been a crucial influence for decades. This book preserves and presents a period, the 1960s in Italy, which was one of radical upheaval and social change. It shows how one political philosopher came to write and think about what was going on in collaboration with others, and how he thought about how to fight on the side of the working class. Now, Tronti's major contribution to Marxist and radical theory was his suggestion that workers' struggles propelled capitalist development, and that anti-capitalist revolution required the political development of the working class. For Tronti, capital's survival depended on its ability to recuperate working class demands, to use the capitalist state. And he illustrated how capital used the workers' fights for higher wages to spur its own innovations, investing in machinery, intensifying exploitation, extending domination. For Tronti, a new strategy was required if the working class was going to break free from this stranglehold, and this he called the strategy of refusal. And this already existed in embryo in the everyday struggles of a defiant working class. And so starting out from these rebellions by industrial workers in northern Italy's industrial triangle, Tronti thought that this political growth of the working class required committed work, organizational labor on the part of militants, like himself. So he and his comrades launched a series of experimental initiatives, editorial initiatives, writing, translating, and they produced newspapers and leaflets, which they distributed at the factory gates and sometimes within factories themselves. So 50 years after this work was first composed, 50 years after the context in which it emerged, why do we need to revisit Tronti today? Well, the way that I prepared this book, I wanted to produce something that was both faithful to its sources and something that could be taken up by organizers and activists today. So those with some modicum of interest and experience in Marxian ideas and political theory will find much of interest here, but also, hopefully, those with, first of all, a commitment to transforming concrete social conditions through struggle. Hopefully you do not need a PhD in Marxism to read this book. The footnotes, of which I've provided a few, are not so much scholarly as they are explanatory. And I wanted to keep the book relatively slim. I think we did an okay job. It's just over 200 pages. But I want to emphasize that it would really only be fitting for the reader to take these notes from Tronti's own laboratory and use them for their own subversive ends today. In terms of the texts themselves, I'll just say a few words. By my count, this is the second book of Tronti's work in English that we now have, following, as Dante mentioned, Verso's publication of Workers and Capital in 2019. And luckily, my book surveys the exact same period. So these are companion volumes, in a sense. What I have here, these works were composed between 1959 and 1967. So this is the same era when Tronti was composing the various essays that Workers and Capital comprises, right? Workers and Capital itself is actually an anthology. You can see at the end of each essay a date when each piece was originally published. And so in my edition, I've also provided prefatory notes for each individual text to tell you where it came from, what the context was in which it was delivered, and any historical information about figures who are mentioned in the text, about events that might have seemed obvious to readers in the mid-60s, but to us today will not be obvious. I mean, by my count, in Workers and Capital, Tronti says everybody knows at least 9 times. And he follows that with some statement. And today, not everybody knows those reference points. Many of us, especially outside of Italy, do not immediately know the difference between 1962 and 1964 in terms of how many strikes there were, or whether inflation was on the rise, or who was in parliament and what governing coalition was planning, for example, to implement democratic planning. So I tried to provide these things through notes for the reader. There's also an appendix to show you how these texts fit into the texts in Workers and Capital so that you could read the two side by side, go back and forth. In some ways, it's a making of documentary of Workers and Capital. It's more focused on the political and organizational context which birthed those texts, right? Which sometimes function at a more abstract, if not somewhat obscure level. These are more immediate personal texts, right? So we have personal letters that Tronti wrote to comrades. We have speeches that he gave to small groups of fellow editors or militants. And then, yes, there are a couple of published essays that were meant for a wider audience. And I think that together, for me, they provide new entry points into Tronti's project, as well as new entry points into Marxist theory and what role theory can play in relation to movements on the ground. And so I hope that with some of these principles in mind, with this kind of, with Tronti's commitment to experimentation as a revolutionary theorist, somebody who experiments, puts forward the results of the experiments in the form of theses, tries to consolidate new perspectives, and then resubmits them for new verification in new situations. I think that this has a lot to offer us today. And of course, we're all operating in very different contexts than Tronti was in the mid-60s. So there's much that might seem specific to its historical context. And that's okay. I didn't want to elide that either. But there, you know, if there's one thing that I would want readers to take away from these texts, it's that there is a pressing political task at hand. And the question is, how can one who might have a certain temperament and training to find themselves writing and reading texts like these, how could one assist and aid in a spirit of complicity and as a comrade, the ongoing struggles of their day in whatever way it might be possible? So I think I will stop there as just a way to introduce a series of kind of broad strokes animating this book. And I know we're going to have much more conversation about a number of topics, which I will let the next speaker, Lorenza, introduce. So thank you all for coming.
Hello, can you hear me properly? Yeah, okay, so first of all, I also want to start by thanking very much like Dante, Clark, Matthew, and Ollie for taking the lead in organizing this very important event, and Andrew for writing this book. I'm speaking like on behalf of Notes from Below in this moment, but I'm also speaking as a person that has not only met Tronti, but has been strongly influenced by Tronti in my own research, in my own work. So this is particularly important for me, and I'm very thankful for inviting me. I'm very proud to be here. I'm also quite, as I was telling Andrew yesterday, I'm also quite moved that he took on this huge task of putting together, of translating all these works. So I think, as we were saying, this book, Andrew's contribution is absolutely important. Is absolutely important not only because he's a very careful historical and political reconstruction of Tronti's political biography and bibliography, but also because it is a task that has been attempted, like the translation work has been attempted, but is of no easy, is no easy work. So afterwards, we would also like to hear a bit more of the concrete example, the concrete experience of translating from Italian, from a difficult Italian to English. I also loved this book for the variety of texts that it puts together. As you were mentioning, not only it combines an old reconstruction of Tronti's life, political life put into context, provided by Andrew in a very careful way, but combines, as Andrew was saying, different kinds of texts. I was particularly impressed by your decision to include letters to Panzieri, letters to Negri, that I think highlight some key differences between these characters. So I found that choice particularly interesting. So overall, I think that this book greatly highlights the role of Tronti, that Tronti had as a theoretical mind behind operaismo, and as and in his leading role in defining a form of political Marxism as a science of antagonism beyond economic determinism. I think this comes out greatly in the book. However, I also think that for all those that are not familiar, especially in the Anglo-Saxon world, in the English-speaking world, but they are not fully familiar with the workerism from the 60s, I think that to grasp the full legacy of how rich the workerism from the 60s was, the work of Tronti and these theoretical contributions must be read together with those more practice-oriented works, especially by Alquati and Pansieri. So I think, and especially remembering the way Tronti himself defines operaismo of those years as a political experience and as a collective experience, I think these texts need to be read all together. So I invite, of course, the readers to complement this. However, I think Andrew has done a brilliant job in opening to the readers what are the key themes and the crucial thoughts behind operaismo as a political experience. So for this, I think this work is excellent. I think I have some comments, and I also want to launch some questions that I'm sure will be complemented by others. I think when reading operaismo, especially those from the 60s and the writings of Tronti, one needs to do the constant exercise of selecting what can be useful today, what can be applied today, and what must be retrieved, distinguishing it from what was and often is very historically rooted in the Italian context. This emerges throughout. I also think, and this is an exercise that we can continue, but that you already launch this exercise of connecting the relevance of some of the texts that you have translated and analyzed to your current political context. So you have started this, Andrew. I'm sure we can continue. From my point of view, without being too long, but the main legacy that we need to extract is something that you have started mentioning, but that certainly includes the centrality of the working class as antagonist subject within the system, the overturning that Tronti frequently talks about, and these what has been defined as Copernican revolution. So this process by which the working class covers a central role not only in triggering revolution, but in determining the direction of capitalist development. So this is absolutely important, and also takes a distance from another Marxist tradition that still sees and reads capital as a science of capital, even within political objectives. So this is one of the main legacies that we need to take home. I think in this sense, while often one might have the feeling that that political experience is strongly linked to the historical setting, and this centrality given to the working class comes from a period where, of course, the working class was in an expansionary conjuncture, as he calls it. At the same time, I think that this is positive at any time. I mean, reading this can only strengthen political action and can give also can also boost those that, like all of us, want to connect Marxism to political action. So I think this is something that is absolutely relevant today and must be considered and taken home, even in periods where, of course, the working classes are relatively different strength. Another important point that, again, I was mentioning is the strong connection between theory and political action. That in other authors is even stronger because they try, like Panzieri and Alquati, they try to properly define a workers' inquiry. Tronti, in your book, you have extracted some pieces where he defines the relationship between Marxism and sociology. But this is certainly a discussion that is important to have and is relevant for all of us that try to connect research and militancy, political action and theoretical analysis. So this is certainly crucial in his work and important to all of us. Finally, or maybe I will stop here in terms of comments, but finally, another important legacy that I think Tronti provides and that you have highlighted very well, besides the way we could agree or not, but is the theory of institutions. Arguable in the way he outlines the party and unions, it's arguable, we can have a discussion. But at the same time, I think it's very important from what point of view? From the way he analyzes and well describes the way institutions in different ways, he talks separately of the party and the union, can be subsumed by the capitalist system. Especially the union is very critical of the unions, but the way the unions act as mediators in the capitalist system. So this, I think, is very important to highlight because put together with these ideal types of party and unions, especially of the party form, I think this, having this in mind as tools for understanding all this can remind us of what ideally party and union should be. And this means also reminding ourselves that the strong class attachment must be revived, must be strengthened. I think this is an old theory that, regardless of its political conclusions, is very important. So another thing that is also a legacy, not exactly our legacy, but something that made me think some experiences are always valid and continue over time, is what emerges from the letter to Panzieri, where he pushes and invites them. He mentions, we need to talk to the workers. And he repeats that. I think this is a call. I took it as a call to avoid idealizing certain experiences, in a sense that I think the problem of the connection between the theoretical side in a political movement and the base, the class base, the problem of sometimes of the lack of connection is frequent, is always there. And they also, the workers had their own critiques. So is a gap that must be filled, that they also had to fill. And there is a gap that I think can be filled through practices like we are trying to adopt of workers' inquiry. The notes from below, comrades can say a few words on this. Going to questions. Sorry, I don't know how long I'm taking. I will launch only 2 or 3 questions. So one is, I would like to hear a bit more of your experience of translation and your approach to the Italian political context. What brought you there, and what difficulties you actually had? I imagine the difficulty, to me, as an Italian speaker, would be extremely difficult to translate. So how was your experience, if you can tell us a bit more? what you thought could be lost in translation. That would be interesting to hear. Another question is, how was your experience, or how do you relate the discussion of the relationship between research and political action, between theory and militant intervention? How was your experience, and what do you think of this, considering all the difficult context of you are also an academic researcher, of the neoliberal university and the very few spaces left for political action within the research space. I don't want to linger on the relationship between working class and institutions, but I think this is a big issue to to discuss, maybe beyond this meeting. Finally, I would like to hear your opinion. I mean, thinking of Tronti, that defines politics as and theory as anticipation. I mean, it's early to say, but talking of his conception of crisis that also provides opportunity for class composition and recomposition, how would you project what's happening now, like in the light of, I mean, this is a question for all, but how do you see the current crisis in terms of possible setbacks, possible opportunities, possible windows to the working class, if any recomposition might happen? Where, I mean, projections and speculation, but I mean, how do you see this in relation to your work on Tronti? I will stop here. I talked for too long. Apologies.
Not at all. I'm sorry, I have a little pop-up. Unmute myself. Okay, can everyone hear me? Okay, so thank you so much, Lorenza, for engaging with the book and for putting so many rich ideas onto the table. I'm not sure I'll be able to adequately address all of these right away, but hopefully over the next hour or so, we'll be able to kind of go in and out of some of these different points. So where to begin? One would be something that you highlighted right at the end, which is Tronti's conception of politics as something which intervenes into the normal operations of capital, for example. This is not the politics that we might think of today as something that goes on within parliament or among heads of state. This is politics as action which disrupts the normal functioning of capital. And I think that, you know, later in his career, he'll distinguish between politics and history. There's also a distinction between theory and politics in this volume. And I think that he, while he was a very careful reader of Marx, and I think that that bears mentioning, although my book does not contain so many of these Marxological texts, Tronti was a keen reader and in fact translator of Marx in the early 60s. And anyone who's read Workers and Capital, especially the hypotheses, the first two major essays, Factory and Society and the Plan of Capital, and then later Marx's Labor, Power, Working Class, which he wrote in 1965, it's clear that he has a strong grasp of the German. He was reading the megas that were collected at the time. I mean, he was deep into the texts themselves. So it's not that Tronti is some sort of vulgar voluntarist who's not interested in production, accumulation, distribution, the value form. And again, there are texts that we could have included in this book that we did not, which address those questions. But it's that at this point in the early 60s, where Italy had experienced 2 decades, decade and a half of post-war intense capitalist development and industrialization and urbanization, migration from the countrysides and from the south to the industrial triangle of the north, Torino, Milano, Genoa. I mean, the struggles that were erupting in the mid-60s indicated something for Tronti and his comrades, that a study, an academic or perhaps analytical study of capital itself could not provide. There was something in the activity of the collective worker and this is a phrase that he uses multiple times and emphasizes, we need to look to the collective worker, not individual workers' experiences of alienation on the assembly line, although that's not completely unimportant. But we need to look at the worker as a collective, struggling subject. Tendentially, a class, a working class as a political concept, not a sociological category. And we need to follow those struggles as our sort of North Star to understand and participate in anti-capitalist revolution. So I think that the question of inquiry and research within, among, in collaboration with, again, in complicity with the working class is very crucial. And indeed, Tronti writes in a register that is different than some of the other workerists, like alquati, or like Danilo Montali, a sort of proto-workerist, Sergio Bologna. Some of these other, perhaps more sociologically inclined, if not in an abstract empiricist or positivist sociology. But Tronti is not necessarily reporting interviews with workers in his writing. He writes in a theoretical register, in a political theory register. Nevertheless, as Lorenza pointed out, and as I try to mention in the book, he was part of a network. He was part of a group, eventually a group of cadre, in his estimation, who were collectively producing theory in collaboration with workers in Italy. And so I think that, this doesn't always shine through necessarily in these texts alone. And that's why I would echo Lorenza's call for people to read not only Tronti, of course, but to read the wonderful historical reconstruction of this period by Steve Wright, Storming Heaven, to read Michele Filippini's book, Leaping Forward, which is about Tronti, but also explores Panzieri and others, and to read more of the primary sources by these other writers as well. I mean, we don't have a lot of it in English. We've had, probably nearly 24 books of Antonio Negri's in English now. This is only the second book from Tronti, so I think we're still catching up there. I don't think we've overdone Tronti yet. But certainly, and we'll get to this later, there's many more brilliant theorists and practitioners of workers' inquiry and co-research from the scene who remain to be translated, who really do need to be translated. And perhaps a volume that combines contributions from different individuals could showcase that sort of that collective laboratory that I think they were working on in the newspaper Classe Operaia, the journal Quaderni Rossi beforehand, and subsequent projects in the later 60s and 70s. I would, I'm thinking what else I might want to address right now before we go on to another question. You asked about institutions as well, Lorenza, and I think this is really important. So, in Tronti's writings of the 60s, as you say, the unions, the trade unions, were understood as a mediating force within capitalist society. So they effectively packaged workers' demands and delivered them to the state and to capitalists in order that the state and capitalists might enact certain reforms that would propel capitalist development. And so in this way, Tronti says, the workers' subjective demands, in fact, become the objective demands of capital. Now, there's one way to read this that is very pessimistic, right? That is very nihilist even, that no matter what kind of things workers could demand, it's always going to be recuperated by capital. There's no outside, there's no escaping it, et cetera. And I think that for Tronti, this is where the party actually comes into play. Not a political party of government already, but for him, it was the Communist Party, which had been excluded from government for decades, had been excluded from the attempts by the center and the center left to create coalitions that could govern Italy in a social democratic fashion, in a fashion that would implement some measures of economic planning, some regional sort of equalization among sectors and levels of development from north to south, for example, something that would allow the assembly lines to continue to run without workers going on strike. So for Tronti, the way to break this is twofold. One, it's in the power of workers to strike, to refuse to work. and also to refuse to bargain politely, to refuse to enter into the offices of the capitalists and of the state, to submit in advance, in triplicate, through Robert's rules, etc., their demands. And then also, there needs to be a leap in organization beyond immediate refusal at the point of production to a struggle against the state. And for Tronti, this is something that the party could provide, or the party was an index of the possibility of this leap in organization, from the struggle against the boss to the one against the state. He talks about this a few times. So, but today we do find ourselves, we find ourselves across an ocean, those of us on this call, but we also find ourselves in completely different economic and political conjunctures. In the US today, right now, all eyes are on Amazon workers in Bessemer, Alabama, and the possibility of them voting to form a union. This is very exciting for many of us on the left in the US. Amazon has sort of routinely fought hard to prevent workers from unionizing, and it would be quite a big deal if the workers there were able to certify and become a union. Does this mean that Tronti's analysis of unions as part of the conveyor belt of capitalist society in the 60s in Italy has nothing to provide? I don't think so, but it does show us that we shouldn't take individual lines or individual claims from his text, pull them out of their context, and immediately transpose them onto our own. We need to think about how he was dynamically responding to a situation, right, where social democracy was a real possibility. It was really on the horizon. In the US today, that's very hard for us to feel, right? We do not have much of a prospect of social democracy on the horizon, despite whatever conversation we could have about more progressive Democrats or electoral initiatives by different organizations. I think that it's easy to sloganize some of Tronti's writings and repeat them ad nauseum, but I really hope that by putting them back into their context and also showing how his perspective changed over the course of the 60s. In the first 3 years of the 60s, you have massive strikes. You have a really surprising explosion of strikes. And then a few years later, just by 1964, you have inflation, you have mass layoffs, you have a completely changed situation. And so his writing responded in dynamic relation to these shifts. And I think that that's really important for us to do today. I don't think I can get into any sort of hazarding, any sort of answer regarding COVID, but certainly this past summer of struggle in the United States, for me and for many comrades here, I know, was extraordinarily exciting. The explosion of anti-racist, anti-police, abolitionist-rooted struggles in the United States was unprecedented, frankly. And I think that, again, a way of taking Tronti not by the letter, but sort of the spirit of his writing, would be to say that today we need to look where these struggles are erupting, look to where people are going into the streets and shutting down cities and looting businesses that represent perhaps commodities that they ill can afford, and seeing how, as leftists, we can support them, how we can help circulate information, how we can help clarify and condense certain principles and slogans, and how we can learn from them, learn from the imminent strategy of refusal that really is still animating the most exciting movements today. And so I think that we don't need to read Tronti in an orthodox workerist way that focuses only on certain highly productive sectors of work. Not that anyone here, I think, is suggesting this. We need to look, in my reading, to be faithful to sort of the principles that animated Tronti in the mid-60s. We need to look to the struggles themselves, and we need to prioritize their growth, their political growth, And there are many experiments that are ongoing, and I think Notes from Below's work in terms of inquiry is very exciting, working with platform workers and delivery workers. Those are crucial contributions, I think, to a 21st century, sort of radical politics that sympathizes with the Trontian viewpoint. And of course there are others, but maybe I'll stop there for now. And I'm sure I didn't get to all of your questions, Lorenza, but feel free to repose them, or others who will be asking subsequent questions, feel free to remind me of something that we should talk about. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Andrew and Lorenza, for that really sort of fruitful discussion that we've just had. I think we're going to move on now to just some questions from a few of the other comrades in the worker study group, starting with myself. And Lorenza already began to mention this in what she was saying earlier around the translation work that went behind this text. And obviously translation is an incredibly political process. Choosing what to translate, how to translate it is an incredibly difficult sort of task to do. And I think what's brilliant about this collection of texts that's just come out for you, Andrew, is as previously has been said, that the sort of wide different sort of selection of texts are presented, essays from classe operaia, letters from Tronti to figures such as Panzieri and Negri, as well as speeches giving to sort of political militants at various events. But obviously, as well as this, sort of the translation of text is obviously a key part of political struggle itself. As has again been previously mentioned, very sort of little work from Operaismo has been translated into English, sort of aside from the massive Negri's work that has been. And this is only the second sort of collection of texts from Tronti that has been translated into English, with sort of the first being Workers and Capital back in 2019. But sort of despite all that, Operaismo and an understanding of Operaismo is growing sort of in the Anglophone world, and there is at least sort of a greater interest in it. So I think in sort of light of all this, I wondered if you could sort of speak a bit more into the translation process and selection process behind the weapon of organization, and also what might need to be translated next in order to continue sort of this better reception of the ideas of Operaismo in the Anglophone world and sort of more generally. So yeah, I'll pass on to you.
Thanks, Matthew. That was a great set of questions, and you reminded me of one of the pieces of Lorenza's comments that I didn't quite get to, which is about translation itself. I really appreciate a formulation in Sandra Metzadra and Brett Nielsen's book, Border as Method, about translation. They reference Antonio Gramsci, and they talk about translation not as a production of an equivalence, not trying to immediately equate and reproduce something, but to translate it into a new concrete context, right, which necessarily involves some distance from the original one. And in my translation, I try to be as faithful as possible to what was written, although in many cases these texts were spoken. So a number of the texts we have here are transcripts collected by comrades involved in Quaderni Rossi and Classe Operaia that were then unearthed or saved in the archive and then unearthed by Giuseppe Trotte and Fabio Milana's book, L'Operaismo degli anni 60, which is really a phenomenal and, as you can see, formidable collection. It's nearly 1,000 pages of primary texts from this period, from Tronti, but also many others. And so a lot of these texts were originally spoken. They were not carefully revised and edited for publication the way that the essays in Workers and Capital were. I think that that's important to keep in mind. I mean, you'll notice sometimes I would remove the repetition of an entire sentence, which is something that we do when we speak and we're trying to emphasize a point, but when writing and reading is not necessary. So in my own kind of translation and my process with my editors at Common Notions, thank you to Andy Battle and Erica Biddle, who really helped with the prose. We focused on trying to clarify and sort of represent what Tronti was arguing. But certainly the languages have a very different rhythm to them. They have a very different musicality. I mean, there's also a formality to Italian, at least as an American English native speaker. There's often a formality to even spoken word in Italian that we don't always use in English. And so I tried to kind of balance fidelity to the original text. Certainly this is not a free form translation, with an attempt to make it legible to today's readers and not overly burdensome to reread a sentence 2 or 3 times. In terms of selection, I was guided in large part by this book, by Giuseppe Tronti and Fabio Milana's book. They unearthed a series of texts and did a phenomenal job contextualizing them. So I profited from their work heavily. I really appreciate it. And I was in touch with Fabio, who was a very patient guide. But I also found texts of Tronti's from this period that were not included there. But these two owe to some of the work by Derive e Prodi in their Biblioteca dell'Operaismo collection. There's really, I mean, for the Italian reader, there's endless sources in Italian attesting to this period. And so you have the full run of Classe Operaia available as a CD here. I pulled one of the speeches from there. And then there's also texts that people can find online that circulate, that you can get from libraries of Tronti's work from the 60s that appeared. There was a journal called Metropolis, for example, in the 80s that republished a series of his previously unpublished works. But certainly there were things that I didn't include from this period that I could have. I mean, first I decided that a sort of, as a periodization, ending around 1967 made sense, because this is when you have the closure of Classe Operaia, the journal. And in some ways the closure, by Tronti's telling, the closure of the experience of Operaismo itself. Of course, after 67, many political collectivities, many of the authors and activists and militants involved in Classe Operaia went on to do things that were, you know, extensions of this project. But in a sort of periodization, until 1967, this is a discrete period of Mario's work. And I think, you know, there were texts I didn't include. There's 2 texts on Gramsci and Gramscianism, which I've previously translated, which are available on Viewpoint magazine online for free, if anyone would like to go read them. And those are quite interesting. And there's also 2 texts that Tronti wrote in the early 60s that really dealt closely with Marx. One is a review of several books on the logic of Marx's Capital. He reads Ewald Ilyenko, for example, and Lucio Colletti and some others. And then there's a text that I think I already mentioned, but which is very interesting, which is Tronti's introduction to a collection of translations that Tronti did of Marx's work, previously unpublished texts by Marx. So there's the notes on James Mill, the notes on Adolf Wagner. There's an early version of Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, and a previously unpublished in Italian appendix to chapter 1 of volume 1, but now I'm getting into the weeds. The point is that that volume ends with Tronti's translation of Workers' Inquiry, of the Karl Marx text in French that he wrote towards the end of his life, that was designed to get to gather kind of testimony from workers about their experience in industry and in, you know, the late 19th century metropolis of Paris especially. So for Tronti, there was this path from the sort of Marxian critique of political economy to the Workers' Inquiry. And he outlines this in that book of translations that he prepared. You know, for me, in this book that I've myself prepared, I wanted to focus on his sort of organizational political experiences and less on his understanding of Marx's critique of political economy. Of course, that's there. We have a lengthy talk here. It's called The Copernican Revolution, where he goes into some discussion of the development of capitalist society, problematizing the notion of a bourgeois revolution. But for the most part, the things we have here are sort of organizational notes. They're letters to comrades about what we should start doing, or why haven't we tried this yet? You know, they're a bit more prosaic in a way, I would hope. And I think that, again, that can provide less intimidating entry points for some readers. For people who are involved in different experiments today, organizational projects on the left, I think they'll find a lot that resonates here, right? With asking, like, what purpose can theory serve? And what can we, who are we to propose anything, right? These are sort of questions that beguile many on the left. And I think that, I hope that these texts speak to that a little bit, while also presenting Tronti's really weighty theoretical contributions to Marxism. And I try to do some of this in the introduction, which interweaves these texts with his more with his more Marxological work, you could say, or his more sort of carefully, cited explorations of Marx. And I hope that altogether they paint sort of a richer portrait of this period than we've had previously in English.
Thanks very much, Andrew, for these really interesting discussions. Thanks also to Matt and Lorenza. It's been really interesting hearing everything in the call so far. My own question for you, Andrew, kind of touches on some of the stuff that's already been discussed. I hope I won't digress too much. I'll try and keep it rooted to the book. But Lorenza mentioned earlier a particular letter that you include in this selection of texts. And this is the letter that Tronti wrote to Panzieri early in January 1963. And as you emphasize in the book, this is a really pivotal period for Italian radical politics. It's not long after the Piazza Statuto riot, and in this, in many ways, kind of prefigures the split in Quaderni Rossi. So it's a really pivotal period. And just like Lorenza was saying earlier, in this particular letter, Tronti repeatedly emphasizes we must begin to speak to the workers. He says this multiple times. And obviously this direct engagement with workers is something that would be really central to the later project around classe operaia. But I was thinking at this point in time, in early 1963, there had already been numerous really fruitful attempts to engage in dialogue with workers. We talked about workers' inquiry, and I'm thinking that there were a lot of Tronti's own close comrades like Alquati and Montaldi who had been engaging in the practice of co-research and workers' inquiry in northern Italy. So I wonder then, to what extent do you think we could argue, or to what extent was Tronti's own individual political thought in this period actually maybe being informed and influenced by ongoing workers' inquiries? And to what extent would Tronti actually establish direct contact with workers throughout the 1960s?
Thanks, Clark. And also I wanted to say that there was one part of Matt's question that I didn't quite answer, but I'll try to combine them, which is what else should be translated. Yes, it's really interesting to see in 1963 Tronti writing to Panzieri saying we must begin to speak to the workers. And I think that indeed Alquati and others had been carrying out inquiries from the early 60s at Fiat, Olivetti, and elsewhere. And so it wasn't a question of we've all been detached intellectuals in our ivory tower writing philosophy and we need to go see what's really going on. I think it was something different. And this essay, this letter also marks the split within Quaderni Rossi, which Tronti leads along with Alquati, Negri, and others, although Negri wasn't so involved in Quaderni Rossi, he was present in some of their discussions. There's this split to found classe operaia. And the split certainly was not about now we will begin to talk to the workers while the philosophers of Quaderni Rossi will remain in their ivory towers not talking to workers. On the contrary, Quaderni Rossi was, many of the members of the editorial board and contributors were engaged in careful sociological research, interviews, contacts, engaging with workers on the ground. So that was not at question, but instead, I take this to be in some ways a sort of a statement meaning to impel the group into closer and constant communication and contact with workers, engagement with collective workers' struggles as comrades, right? Later in the same essay, in the same letter, excuse me, to Panzieri in 1963, he talks about a situation, a genuine dialogue that might emerge, an exchange of theoretical and practical experiences in which it is not true that theory must always come from us and practice must always come from the workers, but in which exactly the opposite could happen. And I think that this, in some ways, prefigures his later suggestion that strategy is the provenance of workers and their struggles, and tactics are the provenance of the party or organization. But I also think that here, talking about a genuine dialogue in which workers produce theory is really important. And this is something that Gigi Ruggiero, for example, highlights in distinguishing between workers' inquiry and co-research, terms which sometimes we use interchangeably today, but which signify different practices. Co-research, of which alquati really is the key figure, right? Co-research involves a co-construction of new knowledge, right? Something that involves a transformation in which there is no static subject and object of the research, right? There's not a sociologist who goes in, pulls out information from their research and fashions a new theory. But instead that there would be a co-constitution of new knowledge that would be part of the struggle itself. And I think that that's how I read Tronti's insistence here in this letter with Panzieri, that we really must begin to be in dialogue with the workers at a deeper level. And this was really important to him. I mean, I think that a lot is made of this split, and I don't mean to take sides in it in any way. I think rich work continued to come out of Quaderni Rossi actually after the split. But Tronti, Alquati, Negri, and others who founded Classe Operaia were quite impatient at this point, 63, 64. They were extremely impatient to participate in the ongoing struggles and help them tip over into something like revolution. They were not content to study the circuits of capital or the arrangement of the workplace, although, you know, these things remain important, of course. But they wanted to experiment with slogans. They wanted to experiment with immediate prompting of workers' action, and they wanted to see what they could do. So to the question of translation, I think, well, sorry, I'll get to translation in a second, which was the part of Matt's question that I forgot to answer. But, you know, translation is extremely, it's bound up with all of this work. I mean, many of the early workerists were translators. Sergio Bologna translated Lukács's Soul and Form. I mean, you had work coming in from France and the US. There was always an interest in the sort of international dimensions of workers' struggles. And again, Tronti himself was a translator of Marx. So there was a careful attention to this question. But, you know, Tronti translated, as far as I can tell, he is the first one to have translated the workers' inquiry text itself. And I think that, you know, we need to understand that as part of his project, right? As part of engaging beyond the analytical texts of the earlier period, exploring the working class's struggle in all of its dynamic unfolding. And so the people who also wrote about that really eloquently and who remain to be translated are some of the figures that Matthew mentioned earlier. Danilo Montali, for example, who wrote about migration, migrants, and different circuits of struggle among militants in the Communist Party, outside of the Communist Party. His work really begs for presentation today. Romano Alquati, we have some of his essays available in English, but a full volume, certainly of his studies on fiat, but going much later, his sort of methodological texts about co-research would also really find, I think, a wide audience in English. And then when it comes to questions of the state and institutions, as Lorenza had been interested in earlier, I would be personally very excited to see more of Luciano Ferrari Bravo's work appear in English. We have a couple essays again, but no full volumes. Panzieri, I do believe that a volume of Raniero Panzieri's writings is on the way in English. I can't say for certain when that will be out, but I think that's on its way. And then, of course, there are many other sort of maybe less spectacular figures who participated in the movements of the 60s and 70s whose work we desperately need. I just read an essay that was published just today by Lorenzo Feltrini and Devi Sacchetto about the workers in the Porto Marghera petrochemical complex outside of Venice, and some of their own writings about noxiousness, about environmental issues, and sort of pioneering a working class environmentalism. I mean, these texts are really exciting. The base committees in Pirelli in 68, 69. There's endless texts, as Steve Wright's upcoming book will explore, from this period and the subsequent one that could be translated, and I think that we could all really benefit from. So again, this is really just one contribution to what needs to be a library. So I hope I got your questions, but again, maybe Clark, if I skipped one piece, I'll catch it on the next on my next turn.
Hi guys, I just wanted to say thanks very much for thanks very much for all the fantastic discussion so far. It's been really interesting. I want to ask a bit of a more general question before we go on to the audience questions, and some of it's been touched on already. But I've been studying Operaismo from a historian's perspective, and one of the interesting things about studying it today is this kind of paradoxical fact that, to me at least, it seems very rooted in 1960s Italy, and it seems, you know, like a sort of it's kind of necessary to place it in that time. But on the other hand, I think Andrew used the phrase living laboratory of ideas in your introduction to refer to the fact that the theories of not just Tronti, but everybody were kind of constantly adapting to political and social and industrial changes as they were going on. So I guess it's not just a question for Andrew, but maybe Lorenza as well. I know, Andrew, in your introductions to the book, you mentioned that Tronti's ideas might be applicable to the climate movement and the abolitionist movement, and, you know, stuff like this that are contemporary to us today. And I know Lorenza's been interested in trying to adapt Tronti's work in other countries as well. So I was wondering if both of you would like to maybe expand a bit upon how do we strike a balance between seeing Tronti's work as a sort of historicized political form and the ways that we can sort of adapt it. Are there any elements of it that we can adapt today? And is there a risk in sort of maybe seeing it as a kind of dogma? And, you know, how do we sort of avoid that moving forward? So pass on to you guys.
I can say a couple things briefly, and then Lorenza, would love to hear your thoughts on these questions. For me, you know, one of the things from Tronti that we really should hold on to is his focus on organization and his resolute opposition to reformism. And I think that this can be a challenge sometimes, but he kind of deftly navigates this hatred of opportunism, as he says in Workers and Capital, this distaste for reform, while also recognizing that forms of mediation and forms of organization are essential to expanding and articulating the existing struggles. So planning and study are not things that are superfluous, that are sort of drowned out by the immediacy of the true vigor of struggle itself. They are also important, right? Cultures of militancy, networks of activists, these things are really important. And so for me, those two things are really important. And I think talking about reformism a little bit more, I mean, this is something that we need to hold on to today for sure when we're talking about police and prison abolition. And I think that abolitionists have long highlighted the fact that calls for police reform, for example, in the United States, have served only to expand the carceral apparatus, to grow the repressive state apparatus, to give it more money and reach over more and more aspects of working class life. And that something like a revolution is required, right? Of course, we can talk about sort of transitional demands maybe, but without something that breaks that capacity of the state to digest demands as reforms that only fuel its growth, something more is required, right? So for Tronti, this is refusal. This is where refusal comes in. It's not bargaining better. It's not offering up a better plan to the capitalists about how to reorganize the workplace. It's about refusing to work and refusing to bargain. And I think that, again, we saw that over this past summer with the upsurges in militancy. We see it with strikes. In Italy, I know there were exciting strikes during some of the lockdowns, workers being asked to return to work. I think that in the era of COVID, it presents a lot of new challenges, certainly. But for me, these are some elements that we can take. And relatedly would be his distaste for catastrophism, right? And I think that this relates to the ecological question, Ollie, that capital is not going to just melt away. Climate change is not going to simply erode the strength of capital. Workers' struggles are going to need to intervene and produce something like a revolution if we are to get away, with survival in like a 22nd century, right? I think that this becomes imperative also when we see the types of reforms that are being offered or sort of suggested by the Biden administration, for example, woefully inadequate attempts to sort of address the climate crisis or climate movements, but instead are the growth of capital in the capitalist state, I would say. So maybe Lorenza has some other thoughts.
Yeah, a couple of thoughts. So one is I was reflecting on, again, this issue of talking to the workers as it emerged from the letter and that was to Pansier that was mentioned before. And I was thinking that to complete the picture, I mean, this made me think that it not only reflected the gradual attempt to connect theory to practice more and more from Quaderni Rossi to Classe Operaia. So that was that shift, but also in a sense, for the non-Italians, a bit of the different context that characterized the worker circles in Rome and in the north of Italy. So there was way more connection to the factory in the industrial north, while in Rome, and this also affected Tronti's relationship with institutions. So in Rome, there was the centrality of institutions and of the theoretical debate. So I think this also affected that discussion between Tronti and Pansieri at that time. I think it was reflected. The context was a bit different, and that persisted over time up to the difference in tactics and in the strategical direction that caused a split afterwards. For what concerns the question of what can we take and what is relevant today, how do you apply? So I will explain what I think is relevant, what we can use today, not only from Tronti, but I mean, considering my own work, I can say how the whole operaismo from the 60s influenced me. So first of all, I think the way I understood and I absorbed the importance of workers' inquiry and co-research, and in the way I developed this idea that research can be a tool for organizing. This is something that the Notes from Below and Viewpoint, these are all these groups are doing. But to say that we started, for example, one of my first experiences of co-research was at the University of London, where we decided to conduct a survey to understand the conditions of precarious teachers. That was a way to say we do research together to inform organizing. So that was a practical application of this belief that research is a tool. Co-research, I had another experience, for example, where we tried in South Africa as well, working together, organizing work, organizers, workers, and researchers. So what it means in practice, Operaismo informed my thoughts on that front. And in my own research work, so one thing was, again, understanding militant research and workers' inquiry as important connection between research and organizing. Second, I think this political tradition gave me some tools in understanding, like this is another question that came from the audience, but understanding capitalist development, not in terms of long cycles today, but in terms of short cycles like innovation. And this is something that you also define in your book, Andrew. Innovation as and reaction as a reaction to restore profit in the moment where the working class is advancing. So this is something that has been shaped by my understanding of how working class advancement shapes and pushes a capital reaction that is not the same as interpreted by others. And finally, I think personally, I've studied an autonomous workers' movement, so a movement that emerged outside of the institutions, spontaneous in a sense at the beginning. And I think that Operaismo gave me the tools to interpret the relationship between spontaneism and organization, and also to reflect on what can be a space for autonomy today. So why some workers, and in particular precarious workers, casual workers, are refusing unions today. What does this mean? This was all, I think, shaped by my readings of these authors.
Sorry about that. So thank you so much for all the questions from the comrades so far. And what we'll now do is there's been a number of questions in the YouTube stream chat. So I'll read those out and pass those on to Andrew and Lorenza, and if anyone else would also like to answer. So the first question, and also if anyone watching also has some questions they'd like to ask to everyone in the call, please do so and put them in the YouTube chat. So the first question we have is from Sai. So at the risk of sounding heretical, how do you, and Andrew or Lorenza, make sense of Tronti's argument about the centrality of working class struggle in capitalist development in a period of 40 years of pretty continuous working class defeat and retreat? Does the Copernican revolution actually help us make sense of the current period in which capital appears able to act unchecked by labour? If that makes sense, I'll pass on to Andrew first.
Sure. It's a very difficult question because, again, as I tried to outline earlier, I don't think that we want to transpose Tronti's theses immediately onto our own situation, right? I think there's I referred to it slightly jokingly in my introduction, but there could be a Trontismo that imagines that anytime there's any sort of crisis, anytime there's any sort of capitalist initiative or reform, that it can be drawn immediately to a struggle. I mean, I think in many cases it can be, but certainly the 2008 financial crisis provoked a new season of thinking about this, about the relationship of crises to struggles. I'm just thinking about my own sort of development. I think that, a question that I have that's related, not so much whether the Copernican revolution still holds, but, Tronti was really, in his commitment to opposing reformism, he was really a close observer of the capitalist state and how different political leaders and different capitalist state managers were attempting to sort of congeal themselves. In some sense, this is part of capitalist class composition, right? It happens through the capitalist state for Tronti. And so, a figure like Aldo Moro, who was a Christian Democrat, right, the center-right party, Moro in the early 60s has this overture to the Socialist Party, this opening to the center-left. And Tronti reads this, as well as later, he reads some economists as these sort of clear-eyed, far-sighted capitalists, right? Do we have these people in government today, or at the levers of power which Moro was at in the 60s in Italy? I don't know, Certainly there are smart economists who advocate redistributive measures in order to save capitalism, right? This is something that you see in the Financial Times. Mariana Mazzucato, for example, is an economist who writes about saving capitalism in a sort of redistributive way, but also with patents and different things. But, sure, we still have some social democratic parties. Some seem to have fighting chances at winning a majority in different elections. But we have a lot of other things going on too. And I think this is what Sai's question points to. There's been 40 years of decomposition and recomposition. There's been, of course, an extraordinary process of globalization of the proletariat, of the industrial working class in places like India and China and elsewhere. I think that certainly we need to rethink from the ground up what kinds of theoretical architecture can support analyses of struggles today, and which might be able to sort of help them think about further organization, right, across perhaps linguistic divides in an internationalist direction, to break free of reformism. And I think it's a worthy question to ask whether the struggles of maybe a working class considered in a broader way, right? If we were to think about tenant struggles, feminist struggles, municipal struggles, anti-racist struggles, to what extent do these drive capitalist development today? I think that that's a worthy question. And I think, concrete researches could begin to address different pieces of this. But so maybe I'll stop there.
Sorry, I keep muting myself. So there's a few more questions from the chat, and I'll pass them on to you now, Andrew. The first is from the comrades, the angry workers. What do you guys make of the contrast between Tronti's subjectivism, his idea that class precedes capital, struggle creates crisis, machinery is a weapon, and then his later return to a pretty deterministic view, the need for a development of forces of production, and how that relates to a question of organization and the Communist Party of Italy?
Well, again, when it comes to the Communist Party of Italy, I think we have to be thinking about our own concrete circumstances today. I mean, in the US, for example, we have nothing like the Communist Party of Italy of the 60s. There's no comparable reference point. Some could try to make a claim for the Democratic Party as like, the leftmost mass party or something like that in the US, but I find this to be a completely unsustainable comparison. And I'm not suggesting the question would have posed this, but for Tronti, it was really important that the PCI had been excluded from government, right? It was never part of the majority governing Italy, except for the very immediate post-war period. And certainly there were municipalities, there were regions of the country where the Communist Party had massive sway, and they had, strong, sort of cultural institutions. And for Tronti, I think this was really important, right? The party was the bearer of a long-term culture of solidarity and struggle that exceeded what the leadership of the party at the time may have called for. And the kind of dense networks that persisted and the sort of purchase that the party had among workers for him was important. And this is not to say that there were not many movements of workers that were stymied by the Communist Party. This is not to say that all of the workers who were rebellious in the 60s identified with the Communist Party. Of course they didn't. We know this from the historical record. But he wagered, especially after the death of Togliatti and this sort of emergence of a debate within the party about its future direction in the mid-60s, he wagered that he uses the word, explode or blow up. We have to really blow up the party and in some ways start over. But nevertheless, for him, there was still something about it that, it wasn't about starting a new party. And it certainly wasn't about never having a party form or a form of organization like a party. For that, he was criticized by many, including Negri and others who went in another direction. I'm not personally interested in taking a side in the debate. I think that it's important to kind of reconstruct what the party was in the mid-60s and how Tronti was relating to it across his whole career. Well, this first decade and a half of his career. The question about determinism, I'm not sure I can answer. I think that, yeah, maybe I'll pass it to somebody else for a minute while I think more about that.
If I ask the question, perhaps while you can reflect on it while I give you forward the other question. So the next question we have is from Stephen. How central do you see the concept of class decomposition being in Tronti's work? It's often seemed to me that in his work and post-operaist writing more generally, it's often overlooked in favour of focusing more on moments of recomposition without looking at how new forms of class composition respond to capital's attempt to decompose working class antagonism.
Definitely. Composition is something that, this is not, this is a term that's more often and more deeply explored by Romano Alquati and others. But I think what's important here is that, again, I've kind of alluded to this before, that for Tronti in the early 60s, right, in 1962, for example, you have 66,000 Fiat workers who joined massive citywide strikes in Turin. And over the last few years, there've been a quadrupling of strike days, right? So you have a completely new, not to mention the events of Piazza Statuto, which were essentially a citywide riot that Clark referred to earlier, bringing in unemployed workers and youths. So I think that, and then by 1964, you have a completely different scenario, right? You have a situation of inflation. You have a situation where workers are being laid off en masse. The confidence and antagonism is at a different level. And I think that this is something, this in some ways gets back maybe to Sai's question about, how useful is Tronti's thought for times when it appears that working class struggle is at an ebb, where perhaps the class has been decomposed such that it is kind of searching around for new forms of organization, for new projects and experiments. I think that this is an important question. I don't have a quick answer, and I think Tronti himself found, many of the workers found by the mid 60s that they were a bit confused with what had transpired over the past few years, because the theory that was forged in a moment of really mass struggle, then the situation changed, and it wasn't totally clear if the theory was still adequate. So Tronti, for his part, begins to, he launches a series of experiments in different ways to conceptualize the relationship between class and party. He has a gambit that perhaps a reorganized party could play some tactical role in supporting the strategy of refusal that workers would hopefully begin to express in new ways, right? And many of the other comrades involved, tried out different strategies, not strategies, that word is loaded here, but they took different approaches. And so I think that we should always be wary of adopting one or two theoretical principles to explain every situation. Instead, again, with this book, I try to chart Tronti's, the transformation in Tronti's own theorizing in relation to these really weighty developments. And this is, again, before 1968, right? So 1968, 1969, the hot autumn, is a whole, I don't want to say it's a whole other ballgame, but in some ways, the terms are completely scrambled, right? And the upsurges are of a totally different scale. And so I think that, that's a different period, right? Where different theoretical discoveries emerge, not only from Tronti, of course, to try to address that and explain, going into the 70s, what's going on. Certainly after, fiscal crises of the mid 70s and later, neoliberalism in the 80s, 90s to today, new theorists working in a sort of Trontian vein have developed all sorts of hypotheses to try to address different contexts of struggle. So yeah, it's not to say that, you know, Tronti of 1963 or 4 has all the answers. It's rather to try to appreciate these writings in their own context, the relationship between militancy and theory and movements themselves, and to try to appreciate that and maybe reproduce something like that kind of relationship in, you know, a million other contexts.
Fantastic, thanks for the answer. So we've got one more question from Steve Wright, but if anyone else watching has any other questions, please post, and then we'll finish up. So Steve Wright asks, I wonder whether Tronti's experience shows how difficult it might be for class autonomy and an institutional turn to go hand in hand. After all, Alquati once asked if Lenin in England was really more Togliatti in Italy.
Thank you, Steve, for the question. And we've talked about this a bit before. You know, I don't know. You know, by institutional term, I'm not sure if you're referring to the Tronti of sort of 67, 68, getting back more involved in the Communist Party, or if you mean his writings in the 70s, where he'll even propose the possibility of wielding the state, or rather updating the state to the point of making the capitalist state a nimble machine that could separate from capital and from capitalists. This is explored in his talk, The Autonomy of the Political, which again is part of a sort of different, in my opinion, a distinct period that's not included in this book here, but which, you know, there are some roots of those ideas present here in the early and mid 60s. And yes, I mean, the focus on organization, there's always a tension, I think, when talking about organization, about what one is referring to, whether it's bureaucracy, rules, mediation. You know, certainly there are many thinkers in the Marxist tradition who have analyzed these things. But also, I think in a Leninist vein, for Tronti, the primacy of organization is not in opposition to spontaneism, because I think we all have enough reason to kind of trouble this binary, right? So I don't mean to pose like a sort of immediate syndicalist, spontaneist tendency opposed to Tronti as something to his left or something like that. But, you know, he also retains this sort of confidence and this sort of trust is not quite the right word, but fidelity maybe, to the working class as the producer of strategy, right? As of the strategy of refusal being imminent to the everyday actions of workers themselves, and of the party being a subordinated instrument to those struggles. And, you know, certainly this is a sort of age-old problem on the left when it comes to communists, anarchists, and different, you know, sort of left tendencies. And I won't pretend to try to quickly, you know, summarize or thread a needle through any of that. But I do think that it's interesting how Tronti is able to both maintain this sort of subordination of the party to the class, and nevertheless always be committed to experiments in organization and the need for organizational forms that can sort of help the more spectacular upsurges in working class activity, help them sustain themselves over a longer period of time, how to grow. And, you know, yeah, we could talk about this forever, a lifetime, but I really appreciate the question.
Fantastic. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming along and listening to all the speakers tonight. Of course, thanks most of all to Andrew for coming to talk to the great book with us, to Lorenza for her reflections, and to the comrades from the Worker Study Group, Clark, Matthew and Ollie, for their involvement as well. Just while we finish up, three main things. First of all, please go and buy the book. I think you can get it from Common Notions in the US and Active Distribution in the UK. We'll put some links for buying the book in the YouTube chat, and you can obviously find it online. Also, please, everyone, if you're interested, follow up with notes from below. They're currently organising a class composition project, which is to pursue more concretely the things we've been discussing tonight regarding class composition and workers' inquiry, and reformulating a better understanding of the questions of workers' struggle today. There should be also some links in the YouTube chat for that. And equally follow up with Viewpoint Magazine, which Andrew's of the editorial collective, to follow along with their work in the US. If you're interested in pursuing some more of these kind of events, the study group has helped organize this event, which me and a few of the other speakers have been involved in. We put a mailing list in the YouTube description, which you can sign up for, and we'll get in contact if we're organizing any more events, or so we can get in contact with people interested. It's a very free-form group. We're just interested in having more discussion and linking up with other projects. So that's it. Perfect. Thanks everyone for attending, and thanks to Andrew for coming to speak, and I hope everyone's enjoyed the discussion.
Thank you very much for an amazing discussion, everyone.